The orbital debris field was wrong. Senior anthropologist Vane Kasari pressed both palms against the observation rail of the research vessel Quiet Sorrow and watched 700 kilometers of wreckage scroll past the viewport. And the first thing his training told him was that none of it should exist in this configuration. 300,000 years of orbital decay should have reduced every fragment to particulate dust, smoothed by solar wind, abraded by micrometeorites, ground down by the slow, patient arithmetic of entropy, until nothing remained but a diffuse haze too fine to catch light. That was the model. That was what every prior dead world excavation the Drenathi academic Concord had conducted across 9 surveyed systems had produced. You arrived at the dead world. You found dust. You descended through it like sinking through fog. You began your work on bones and silence. This was not fog, and this was not silence. The fragments held formation, not the ragged tumble of natural decay, but the deliberate geometry of objects placed with intention. Some pieces were dark, carbon-scarred, ancient, clearly from the original extinction window the Drenathi survey had predicted 300 millennia ago. But others caught the light with a polished gleam that had no business existing after that span in hard vacuum. And threaded between the old wreckage and the new were structures that Vane's instruments could not categorize at all. Long, angular, running in parallel tracks that curved with the planet's rotation, as though they had been set there like fence posts along a property line nobody had given the Drenathi permission to cross. Navigation, rerun the density scan. Vane's voice carried flat across the observation deck. The deck was designed for 16. 23 people occupied it now, his 15-member anthropological team, their assistants, and the handful of ship's officers who had found reasons to be present since the first anomalous reading had come in 40 minutes ago. Navigation Officer Torin, young, competent, her dorsal crest flattened against her skull, and the involuntary Drenathi signal for sustained alarm had already rerun it. Same result, Senior Anthropologist. The debris field is layered, 3 concentric rings. The outer ring matches expected decay. Old carbon, ablated metal, consistent with 300 millennia drift. The middle ring is younger, significantly younger. Carbon dating puts it at roughly 40,000 years. And the inner ring. Torin's hand stopped moving on her console. Active thermal signatures, power generation consistent with automated systems. The inner ring was constructed within the last 500 years. She paused. And it is currently tracking our fleet. Behind Vane, no one moved. He could feel the silence spreading through his team like cold water, filling a basin, each researcher arriving independently at the same conclusion. The dead world they had spent 14 years and 3 grant cycles preparing to excavate was looking back at them through targeting systems that predated the expedition's paperwork. Vane pulled up the original survey file on his personal console. He had read it so many times during the 11-month transit that he could recite passages from memory, but he read it again now with different eyes. Expansion Authority Scout Vessel the Naris, cataloging pass 300,000 years prior. 11 hours in orbit. No landing. No contact. Species designation. Bipedal, warm-blooded, socially organized, tool-using approximately 8 billion individuals. Environmental trajectory. Atmospheric failure, resource depletion, terminal population decline. Classification. Category 9 cultural fossil. Recoverable artifacts, no living population, no strategic value. File closed. 11 hours. The scout had spent 11 hours deciding this world was dying, filed the report, and left. And in those 11 hours, 8 billion beings had been reduced to a line item in an administrative database, tagged for future excavation, and forgotten for 300,000 years. Fleet Commander Oreth arrived on the observation deck 6 minutes later, which told Vane that the military assessment was already further along than the academic one. Oreth was tall even for a Drenathi, broad through the chest, dense with muscle that age had not yet diminished, wearing the functional armor he reserved for decisions that carried consequences. His ceremonial plates were nowhere in evidence. Two tactical officers flanked him. They had the particular expression of soldiers whose routine escort assignment had just been reclassified in a direction they did not enjoy. "Tell me what I am seeing, anthropologist." Vane summarized: the layered debris field, the active inner ring, the tracking signatures. Oreth listened without interrupting, which was itself unusual. The commander was not a patient man by nature, and his willingness to let Vane finish told Vane that the military conclusions were already drawn. "The weapon mounts on the inner ring," Oreth said when Vane finished. "They are not powered, they are active. There is a difference. Powered means they could fire. Active means they are choosing not to." "You are saying the platforms are exercising judgment." "I am saying the platforms were built by someone who anticipated exactly this situation and designed a response protocol that begins with observation rather than engagement." Oreth stepped to the viewport and studied the inner ring with the practiced eye of a man who had spent his career reading military architecture. The spacing is precise. Each platform covers the gaps in its neighbor's firing arcs. The outer ring, the old debris, serves as a natural obstacle field, forcing any approaching fleet into predictable corridors. The middle ring reads as sensor infrastructure, passive detection, probably gravimetric. The inner ring is the teeth. He turned back to Vane. "This is not improvised. This was designed by someone who had a very long time to think about it and chose to use that time well." "Commander, the charter says the academic expedition leader decides whether to proceed or withdraw." "I know the charter, Kasari. I also know that the fleet I am responsible for is currently sitting inside a defense architecture that outclasses anything the Conquered has deployed, and the entity that built it is watching us decide what to do. I recommend we decide quickly and correctly. First contact protocols, hydrogen band transmission, standard mathematical handshake." Oreth nodded once. "And understand this, anthropologist. If these platforms have been tracking us since we entered the system, then whoever built them already knows we are here. The handshake is a courtesy. It is so they know we understand what courtesy means." The transmission went out on the hydrogen band, prime numbers, the universal quiet frequency. The response came in 4 seconds. Not mathematics, a voice. Clear, measured, and speaking flawless Drenathi. Not trade Drenathi. Not the simplified pidgin that commercial species sometimes acquired through contact with conquered merchants. Academic Drenathi, spoken with the precise regional inflection of the Conquered's capital university system, with phonemic accuracy that exceeded most native speakers Vane had taught alongside. Drenathi research vessel Quiet Sorrow, this is Meridian Orbital Control. You are cleared for approach on Corridor 7. Atmospheric entry will be guided. Do not deviate from the assigned vector. A landing zone has been prepared at coordinates transmitting to your navigation system now. Welcome to Earth." The observation deck went silent, not the dramatic silence of fiction. The working silence of professionals recalculating, each one running the same equation. A dead world should not be speaking our language better than we speak it ourselves. Torin's voice, very quiet. The navigation data they transmitted is formatted in Drenathi standard encoding. They are using our file structure. Vane ordered a full planetary survey before descent. Passive sensors only. The escort fleet, 4 warships and 2 logistics vessels, held position at the defense ring boundary, weapons cold, shields down. The survey took 11 hours, and every hour rewrote the file. The atmospheric composition came first. 300,000 years of unmanaged biospheric decay should have produced a toxic, stagnant envelope, methane-heavy, oxygen-depleted, choked with the chemical residue of industrial collapse. What the sensors reported was a breathable nitrogen-oxygen mix, with trace elements so precisely balanced that Dr. Pellon, Vane's atmospheric specialist, ran the analysis 3 times before she would speak. "Someone is maintaining this atmosphere," she said. "The carbon cycle has been engineered. There are filtration signatures in the upper troposphere consistent with large-scale atmospheric processing. This is not a wild biosphere. This is a managed one." The surface data was worse, or better. Vane was losing his ability to distinguish. The original survey had recorded a planet in early environmental collapse, deforestation, soil erosion, rising sea levels, atmospheric carbon trending toward runaway greenhouse. The Scout had logged 8 billion individuals and assigned them a projected extinction window of 2,000 to 4,000 years. Standard procedure. What Vane's sensors showed was a planet that bore no resemblance to that projection. The forests had returned, not as thin recovering patches but as vast unbroken canopies stretching across entire continents, deeper and older than anything the original survey had recorded. The oceans were clean, the ice caps stable, the river systems redesigned, their courses engineered to optimize freshwater distribution across landmasses, reshaped to support the biosphere rather than extract from it. And between the forests, visible from orbit with unaided optics, were cities. Vane had excavated dead cities on 6 different worlds. He knew what ruins looked like from space: geometric patterns in soil, discoloration from buried foundations, the faint spectral signature of collapsed infrastructure being reclaimed by geology. Dead cities were ghosts. These cities were not ghosts. They sprawled across the continents in clusters connected by corridors of infrastructure the team initially mistook for rivers, until spectral analysis returned readings of metal and composite, not water. The buildings were tall, some reaching into the lower atmosphere, their upper sections disappearing into cloud layers. They caught light in ways that suggested materials the conquered had no designation for. Dr. Kellon, the materials scientist, stared at his readings for 40 minutes before offering a single comment. "The molecular bonding patterns do not match any known material in the conquered database. I do not have a classification for what those structures are made of." Vane presented the preliminary data to Orath on the command deck. "The planet has a breathable atmosphere, a managed biosphere, cities covering 12% of the landmass with architecture beyond our material science, and an orbital defense network tracking our fleet." The file says they were dying. The file was written by a scout who spent 11 hours in orbit 300,000 years ago and never landed, Orath said. "The file was wrong. Request descent permission." The descent took 40 minutes on a navigation beam, so precise the pilot later described it as being carried by a hand that knew where every finger should go and had practiced the motion longer than the pilot's species had existed. The escort fleet remained in orbit, crews watching hull camera feeds, with the focused attention of people rewriting their understanding of the universe in real time. As the quiet sorrow passed through the lower atmosphere, it came within 2 kilometers of one of the warships. At that distance, the scale became something Vane's mind could not assimilate without physical symptoms. His hands gripped the rail. His breathing changed. The warship filled the viewport not the way a structure fills a window, but the way a landscape fills it. The hull was a terrain, not a surface. Panel lines wider than the quiet sorrow's wingspan. Sensor arrays the size of Drenathi government buildings. Maintenance bays open to the atmosphere with transit vehicles moving inside them. The hull banded in gray and silver and a deep burnished blue, and the blue sections were warm to the scan, energy absorbent, harvesting solar radiation through the hull material itself. "How many crew?" Vane asked. His voice was not entirely under his control. "That vessel class carries approximately 12,000 personnel." Odessa's voice came through the communications feed. She was on the surface, already waiting. "It is one of the smaller patrol-class ships. The larger vessels are stationed at the system's outer boundary. There are larger vessels. There are vessels that make the patrol class look the way your escort fleet looks next to the patrol class. They are not relevant to today's visit. The quiet sorrow continued its descent, and the warship slid past the viewport like a cliff face receding. And then there were more, dozens, hanging at varying altitudes in the bright afternoon sky, each one motionless and patient and indifferent to the research vessel passing beneath it. Vane stood at the observation deck as the clouds parted and the city revealed itself. It stretched from horizon to horizon. Towers and bridges and elevated transit lines and open plazas and waterways woven between the structures like veins through a living body. The tallest structures pierced the cloud layer, their surfaces shifting color and reflectivity as the angle changed, responsive to sunlight in ways Vane's material science had no vocabulary for. A mid-level canopy of structural lattices connected the towers at intervals, creating sheltered districts beneath, an engineered atmosphere within an atmosphere. The architecture was unlike anything in the Drenathi database. These were not the structures of a mature civilization. These were the works of a people who had been building continuously for longer than Vane had professional categories to describe. And above the city, the warships hung in the bright sky like fixtures mounted on an invisible ceiling, each 3 kilometers or more, arranged in groups of 3 and 4, their hulls catching the afternoon sun, projecting no threat, existing the way mountain ranges exist, permanent, immovable, indifferent. The smallest of them could have swallowed Oreth's entire escort fleet. The quiet sorrow landed on a platform at the city's western edge. The platform was larger than any Drenathi carrier's flight deck. Clean, smooth, constructed from a material that appeared to resist accumulation of any kind. On it stood a single ground vehicle and 3 figures. The figures were human. Vane had handled human remains on 6 excavation sites. He had reconstructed a human settlement from pottery shards and fossilized tools. He knew their anatomy from skeletal analysis. Bipedal, bilaterally symmetrical, endoskeletal, cranial capacity, noted in the original file as adequate for tool use. The 3 humans on the platform did not match the file. They were taller than the skeletal reconstructions predicted. They stood with a stillness that was not passivity but control, the structural composure of people whose foundations went deeper than what showed above the surface. They wore simple clothing and materials Vane's trained eye could not identify. No armor, no weapons, no rank insignia. One stepped forward as the ramp lowered. Female, middle-aged, close-cropped gray hair, brown eyes carrying neither welcome nor warning, only the level, patient attention of someone who had been waiting for this moment and intended to manage it precisely. Senior anthropologist Kasari. She spoke his name in Drenathi with his own academic inflection, not approximate, exact. My name is Odessa Vale, cultural liaison for the Meridian Administrative Region. We have been expecting you. Vane stopped at the ramp's base. His team stood behind him, recalibrating. Oreth's 6-soldier escort remained at the top, weapons holstered, eyes locked on the warships overhead, their training telling them to assess the threat while their assessment told them the word had lost its meaning. You have been expecting us. Your fleet entered our extended sensor range 4 days ago. Approach vector and registry codes matched the Drenathi Academic Concord's standard expedition profile. We have maintained records of every Drenathi survey conducted in this system, including the original cataloging past 300,000 years ago. We knew what you were coming for. You knew we were coming to excavate. Something shifted around Odessa's eyes, a fractional adjustment that might have been pity, might have been patience, might have been the disciplined suppression of an emotion Vane did not have the cultural context to read. We knew you were coming to excavate what you believed was a dead world. We thought it would be more productive to show you the living one. Vane glanced at the soldiers on the ramp. 6 trained military personnel, each carrying a sidearm that represented the best personal weaponry the conquered produced. They looked like children holding sticks. They knew it. He could see it in the careful way they did not look at each other. The tour began that afternoon, and Vane understood within the first hour that it was not a tour. It was an education, delivered with the unhurried precision of a senior colleague briefing a junior one, calibrated to the listener's pace, comprehensive, patient, carrying the implicit understanding that the information mattered and the listener deserved to receive all of it. Odessa led them in a ground transport through the western district of Meridian Prime. Her Drenathi flowed without hesitation, her knowledge of Drenathi cultural reference points precise enough that Vane suspected she had spent years, perhaps decades, preparing for this category of visitor. Dr. Pellon leaned forward as they passed residential towers with balconies draped in living plants, not ornamental but functional, integrated atmospheric scrubbers woven into the architecture of daily life. The particulate count outside the transport is 0.03 per cubic centimeter. That is cleaner than any laboratory on Drenath. Each district manages its own air quality through filtration built into the structural materials of the buildings, Odessa said. The material was developed approximately 48,000 years ago. It has been refined several hundred times since. Dr. Kellon added, his voice strained. The building materials are self-repairing. The molecular structure includes an integrated repair mechanism that responds to microdamage in real time. We do not have anything comparable. We do not have a theoretical framework for anything comparable. The first stop was a structure Odessa called the Archive of Arrival. Built into the bedrock beneath the Western District, accessed through a portal that opened in a public plaza floor so seamlessly, Vane did not see the seams until they had descended 30 meters. Corridors wide enough for 6 abreast, lit by warm ambient light from the walls themselves. And lining those corridors, in display cases mounted at eye height with the meticulous care of a museum that took its curatorial duties as seriously as its engineering, were artifacts. Drenathi artifacts. Vane stopped at the first case. Inside it, mounted on a neutral display surface, sat a Drenathi survey beacon, standard expansion authority issue deployed during cataloging passes as routine, 300,000 years old, intact. Its casing bore the serial number of the original scout vessel Venaris. We recovered it from the ocean floor 62,000 years ago, Odessa said. It had been transmitting a low-power status pulse for 40,000 years. We detected it when our sensor technology matured. By the time we retrieved it, we had already decoded the transmission format and built a working model of Drenathi communication architecture. Vane looked down the corridor, case after case stretching into the warm-lit distance, each holding a piece of Drenathi equipment. Everything your survey team left behind. Every beacon, every probe, every sample container, every fragment of hull plating shed during atmospheric entry, recovered over 180,000 years, studied, reverse-engineered, the alloys decoded and replicated, the language matrix extracted and modeled. You reverse-engineered our alloys. Your alloys, your communication protocols, your data storage formats, your navigational mathematics, and your linguistic structure. The alloys were the simplest component. Your language was the most complex. At the main corridor's end, in a case larger than the others, Vane found a Drenathi data crystal standard format, the compressed cultural package embedded in every survey beacon as a redundant introduction to the Drenathi species. Beside it, printed on a material he did not recognize, lay a complete translation. Every line, every glyph, every cultural context note rendered in human script and annotated with cross-references to Drenathi linguistic structures so detailed that Vane, a fluent speaker and published philologist, Learned something new about Drenathi grammar from reading a human's analysis of it. When was this translation completed? The first working draft, approximately 140,000 years ago. It has been revised 812 times. The current version is considered authoritative. 140,000 years ago. The Drenathi conquered had existed for 12,000 years. When humans completed their first draft, the Drenathi had not yet discovered fire. Vane walked back along the corridor counting. 40 cases, 60, 100. The corridor branched, each branch holding more. Survey probes with housings intact. Atmospheric samplers with collection membranes preserved under inert gas. Navigation buoys ejected during the original orbital pass, each now mounted under controlled lighting, serial numbers legible, casings unblemished by 300 millennia. These people had treated the Drenathi survey equipment with more care than the Drenathi had treated the entire planet. As they left the archive, Odessa paused at a side corridor. There is one more thing. It is not required viewing, but you may find it relevant. The side corridor led to a single room containing a holographic projection table. Odessa activated it, and the air filled with light. Orbital footage, grainy, ancient, taken from a perspective Vane recognized immediately. The angle, the sensor overlay format, the timestamp encoding, footage from the scout vessel the Naris. 11 hours of orbital observation, 300,000 years old. You recovered the original survey footage. The scout ejected telemetry buoys during the pass. Each contained a compressed copy of the survey data. We recovered 2 of the 4 buoys. This is the visual record of the moment the Venaris scout decided our species was dying. Vane watched. Earth 300 millennia ago. Brown continents, gray oceans, atmospheric pollution visible from orbit, coastal cities drowning under rising waterlines, deforestation scars, the faint heat signatures of 8 billion beings clustered in failing infrastructure on a planet visibly losing its ability to sustain them. In the projections corner, the scout's classification notation blinked. Category 9, cultural fossil. No strategic value. Vane stared at that notation for a long time. Then he looked at Odessa. She was watching him with the expression of someone who had shown this recording before and understood what it did. You kept this. We keep everything, anthropologist. That is the point. That evening, Vane returned to the quiet sorrow and briefed his team in the research bay. He kept it factual. The archive data, the atmospheric readings, the city scans, the warship profiles, the defense platform analysis. The data spoke for itself, and what it said turned 15 experienced faces into variations of the same expression. The look of people who had learned that the map they had been following did not describe the territory. Dr. Rithani, the xenolinguist, had spent the afternoon analyzing the linguistic annotations on the data crystal translation. Their understanding of our language exceeds our own formal analysis. The cross-referencing system they developed identifies grammatical structures in Drenathi that our own linguists have not formally described. They found patterns in our language that we missed. Vane opened a channel to Commander Oreth in orbit. Your military assessment, Commander. My military assessment is that we are guests, Kasari. We are guests in a house that could remove us from existence at any moment and has chosen not to. And the fact that they have chosen not to is the most important military data I have collected in 30 years of service. Oreth leaned forward on the screen. The platforms tracked us continuously during your surface visit, not aggressively. The way a guard watches a visitor in a museum. They know where we are. They know what we are capable of. They have calculated to a certainty I find uncomfortable that we are not a threat, and they are correct. Is there anything suggesting hostile intent? Nothing, and that is what concerns me most. Hostile intent I understand. I can model it. This is a civilization that has removed the possibility of being threatened and declined to use that position aggressively. I do not have a doctrine for that. The second day began at dawn. Vane had not slept. He had spent the night in the research bay cross-referencing archive data with the original survey file, watching discrepancies multiply like fractures spreading through glass. Every comparison made the survey look smaller. The original scout had spent 11 hours in orbit and produced a 64-page report. The humans had spent 180,000 years recovering every trace of that visit and produced an archive that would take Vane's entire team years to catalog. He had also reviewed the atmospheric data more carefully, and what he found in the detailed readings removed any remaining doubt about the scale of what this civilization had accomplished. The atmospheric management was not centralized. It was distributed. Every building surface, every engineered green space, every water feature in the city participated in a planetary-scale atmospheric cycle. The entire urban landscape was a single integrated environmental processing system disguised as a place where people lived. The Concord's best atmospheric facilities managed controlled environments of a few hundred cubic meters. These people managed an entire planet as casually as the Drenathi managed a laboratory. Dr. Kellon had run additional spectral analysis on the building materials during the evening return trip and confirmed his initial assessment. The molecular structures were self-repairing. Microdamage triggered an autonomous reconstruction response at the molecular level. The Concord did not have comparable materials. The Concord did not have a theoretical framework for comparable materials. Kellon had published 31 papers on advanced material science. He told Vane quietly before retiring for the night that every one of those papers would need to be rewritten. Vane requested access to the defense infrastructure. Odessa granted it without hesitation, and the immediate openness told Vane what he needed to know. The infrastructure was not fragile. A civilization that conceals its military does so because exposure could compromise it. A civilization that opens without conditions does so because exposure changes nothing about the outcome. They flew east in a transport that moved at speeds Vane's instruments could not fully track. City to agricultural zone to forest to coast to open ocean, each transition seamless, each zone managed with the same invisible precision. Then something broke the ocean surface. A structure rising from the seafloor, running north to south for over 1,000 kilometers, dark and massive and solid, like the spine of a sleeping creature. The shelf, Odessa said, one of 4. Each anchors approximately 12,000 deep ocean monitoring stations. Nothing enters the water column at any depth without being detected. Nothing biological larger than a mid-range fish. Nothing mechanical of any size. They continued east. Above the next landmass, the orbital defense ring resolved against the morning sky. From below, looking up, the platforms were dark shapes against the blue, hundreds of them, catching the sun at their edges, connected by geometry so precise the ring looked less like individual stations and more like a single structure wrapped around the planet. 942 active defense platforms, Odessa said. 7 concentric rings. Each operates independently but integrates with any other within 4 seconds. Automated for approximately 180,000 years. No crew, no resupply, no maintenance beyond internal repair systems. They landed on one of the platforms. Vane stepped onto a surface older than his species' recorded history and felt nothing but absolute solidity. No vibration, no hum. When Odessa brought up the operational readout, the numbers made his training stutter. Power output, steady within 0.2% across 192,000 years. Structural integrity, 99.98%. Weapons systems, hundreds per platform, fully charged, fully maintained, fully operational. The weapons have never fired, Odessa said, watching his face. Not once in 192,000 years. maintained at full readiness every day, never used. Then why maintain them? Because readiness is not about the fight you expect. It is about the fight you make unnecessary by being ready. Every species that has approached this system in the last 100,000 years, and there have been 19 prior to your expedition, has seen these platforms, read the power signatures, run the calculations, and chosen to announce themselves peacefully. That outcome was designed. That outcome is the purpose. Vane walked the platform's perimeter, 300 meters across, every surface functional. Sensor arrays, power conduits, repair bays where autonomous maintenance systems sat in housings showing the faint wear of 192,000 years of continuous operation, but no degradation. The repair systems maintained the platform. The platform housed the repair systems. The loop was closed. The loop had been closed longer than the Drenathi species had been building permanent structures. Torin, who had accompanied the surface team, crouched beside one of the weapon housings and ran her scanner across it. She stood up slowly, her crest fully erect. Senior anthropologist. The power core of this single platform outputs more energy than the Quiet Sorrow's main reactor, and according to these readings, it is operating at 11% capacity. She looked at Odessa. What is full capacity? You would need to be further from the surface to observe full capacity safely, Odessa said. It was not a threat. It was a technical specification. Vane looked at the weapons arrays. Clean lines, machined surfaces, engineering so refined that function was expressed entirely in form. They did not look aggressive. They looked inevitable. How does a civilization maintain coherence across 300,000 years? He asked. Civilizations fracture. They lose institutional memory. They forget their own history. That is the pattern across every species the conquered has studied. Including yours, Odessa said. Including ours. The answer is that we chose not to forget, not passively, actively. We built forgetting out of our institutions the way an engineer builds weakness out of a structure. Every child born on Earth learns the history of the crisis, not as mythology, as data, as the measured, documented, verified, annually recalibrated account of how close we came to ending and what it cost to come back. She brought up a secondary display. A timeline stretching across the screen in a single horizontal line. 300,000 years. Continuous records, environmental data, population metrics, engineering milestones, defense logs, cultural markers, linguistic tracking, agricultural yields, educational performance. All tracked, stored, cross-referenced, maintained, unbroken. That memory is the foundation. Everything else, the cities, the defense ring, the warships, the atmospheric engineering, is built on top of it. The Drenathi Conquered's oldest surviving record was 9,000 years old, stored in a climate-controlled vault, maintained by 3 archivists, considered a national treasure. The humans had 300,000 years of continuous data accessible from a console on a defense platform. Commander Oreth's tactical assessment arrived via encrypted channel that evening, and Vane read it in the research bay with the lights dimmed. If those platforms decided to engage, the engagement would last approximately 9 seconds, and our fleet would not be a factor in the outcome. This is not a military assessment I am accustomed to delivering. In 30 years of service, I have never encountered a defense posture that renders my entire force irrelevant as a matter of simple engineering math rather than active hostility. They do not need to threaten us. They do not even need to notice us, in a military sense. Our fleet is an administrative consideration at best. Vane closed the message and sat in the dark. He thought about the Expansion Authority's classification system. Category 1 through Category 10. Category 10 was a dead system, no recoverable value. Category 9 was a dead world with recoverable artifacts, which is what Earth had been filed as. The categories ran downward from there through various stages of diminished civilization, primitive species, pre-tool use biospheres. There was no category for what Earth actually was. The classification system did not account for the possibility that a species tagged for extinction could pull itself back from the edge, rebuild its planet over 30,000 years, construct a defense network that made the conquered's military look like a historical footnote, decode the language of the species that had cataloged it, and then wait for 62,000 years for someone to come back, not for war, but for conversation. The Expansion Authority had never imagined that a Category 9 world could become something that the category system itself was not designed to describe. That night, alone in his quarters aboard the Quiet Sorrow, Vane reviewed the expedition's original mission charter. He had drafted it himself 14 years ago in his office at the Concord's Central University. The language now read like a document from a different civilization. Excavation Target 4417 represents a standard Category 9 recovery opportunity. The dominant species achieved early industrial development before environmental collapse rendered the biosphere non-viable. No living population is expected. The primary objectives are artifact recovery, cultural reconstruction, and the completion of the Concord's archaeological record for this galactic sector. He had written those words with the confidence of a professional operating within a framework he trusted. The framework assigned civilizations to categories based on their survival outcomes. Category 9 was dead. Dead worlds yielded artifacts. Artifacts yielded publications. Publications advanced careers. That was the system, and the system had never failed him because he had never tested it against a world that refused to cooperate with its assigned category. He closed the charter and opened the window beside his berth. Through the port, the defense ring was visible against the night sky, 942 platforms pulsing in slow synchronization, each pulse a heartbeat in a system that had been beating continuously for 192,000 years. Below the ring, the lights of Meridian Prime spread across the continent in clusters that looked, from this altitude and in this darkness, like the embers of a fire that someone had been tending since before his species learned what fire was. Vane stared at those lights for a long time. Then he went back to the research bay because he could not sleep, and he would not be able to sleep until this expedition was over, and possibly not for some time after that. On the third morning, Vane asked to see the graves. He did not fully understand why. It was not part of any protocol. It was something that had been building since the first scan came back wrong, a need to understand what a people who refused to forget did with their dead. Odessa took him to a place she called the Long Walk. In the highlands, 2,000 kilometers north of Meridian Prime, in mountains the original survey had noted as geologically stable. They walked from the transport's landing plateau. Vane, Odessa, 2 team members. No soldiers, not a place for weapons. The Long Walk was a path cut into the mountainside, wide enough for 4 abreast, winding upward through dark stone for 7 kilometers. On both sides, walls of hand-dressed basalt rose to shoulder height, and into the stone, at intervals of exactly 1 meter, names had been carved. Not inscribed by machine, not printed, not projected, carved by hand into stone that would outlast anything except the geological processes that had formed it. Vane touched the first name. Deep, clean, precise. The work of someone who understood that the depth of the cut was proportional to the number of centuries the name would survive. A plaque beneath it, in Dranathi and 4 other languages, gave the translation. A name, a birth date, a death date, and a single line. Perished in the Great Collapse, remembered. He looked down the path. It stretched upward, climbing, disappearing around a bend, walls solid with names on both sides. He looked at Odessa. How many? 7,600,000,000. Every recorded death during the crisis period and immediate aftermath. Compiled over 4,000 years from recovered records, genetic databases, and archaeological evidence. The carving has been continuous for 112,000 years. It is not yet complete. Vane put a hand against the wall. Beneath his palm, the edges of carved letters. Someone's name. Someone who had lived and died 300,000 years ago on a world that was supposed to be empty. Someone the Drenathi file had reduced to a population statistic in a footnote about resource depletion. 112,000 years of carving. Volunteers, there is never a shortage. The work is considered a privilege. Each carver completes approximately 50 names per day. They work in silence. When a section fills, new stone is quarried and set. The path now extends 31 kilometers. Vane walked. He could not stop himself. His team members walked behind, then fell back one by one as the scale overwhelmed them, sitting on stone benches placed at intervals along the path, rest stations for the carvers, worn smooth by 112,000 years of use. Vane kept walking. Odessa walked beside him without speaking, and the silence between them was not empty. It was the fullest silence Vane had ever experienced. It held 7 billion names, and the patience to carve every one of them by hand into stone that would outlast the species doing the carving. The path climbed steadily. The afternoon sun moved across the mountains, and the shadows of the carved letters shifted and deepened, and the names passed on both sides in an unbroken stream, millions of names, billions of names, each one rendered with the same deliberate precision, the same depth of cut, the same respect for the person it commemorated. Names in the ancient script, barely legible to modern humans. Names in the transitional script of the recovery period. Names in the modern script, clean and angular, translated beneath in Drenathi, and 4 other languages that Vane did not recognize. Each with the same line beneath it, remembered. Not a monument, not a memorial built and abandoned. A project, an ongoing, active, deliberate act of memory sustained for longer than most civilizations lasted. He stopped at a section where the names were fresher, carved within the last few hundred years, the stone a shade darker, quarried more recently. The carving technique was identical. Whatever standards the carvers held, they had not drifted over 100,000 years. One plaque differed from the others. Instead of the standard line, it read, "Perished in the Great Collapse," identified from genetic material recovered from a northern temperate site 147,000 years after death, named by descendant analysis, remembered. 147,000 years after death. They had identified someone from genetic material recovered across that span and carved the name into stone so it would last another 100,000 years, and another, for as long as the species endured and the stone held. Dr. Rithani was standing 3 meters behind him. She was crying. Quietly, hands at her sides, crest fully displayed, tears running down her face, reading the names on the wall. She had spent 20 years reconstructing dead languages from fragments. These people had spent 112,000 years ensuring not a single name was lost. Dr. Rithani. "I am fine, senior anthropologist." She was not fine, neither was he. Near the end of the second hour, the path opened onto a wide platform overlooking a valley. Green. Ancient forest, unbroken, stretching to the horizon. In the far distance, city towers caught the late afternoon light. Above them, warships. Above the warships, the silver thread of the orbital ring. Vane sat on the platform's edge. His legs would not carry him. It was not fatigue. It was the weight of understanding arriving all at once, too large to carry standing. Odessa sat beside him. For a long time neither spoke. The wind off the valley carried the smell of the forest below, rain and growth and mineral earth, and something clean that Vane's homeworld had not smelled like in centuries. Above the valley, the warships held their stations in the bright sky, and the orbital ring traced its silver line from one horizon to the other, And the world turned beneath all of it with the patience of a thing that had decided, a very long time ago, that turning was what it intended to keep doing. The 400 million, Vane said finally, the survivors. What about them? How many survived? Vane asked. At the lowest point, approximately 400 million, down from 8 billion. A 95% population loss. I have excavated civilizations that collapsed from lesser declines. So have we study what they did wrong. The difference was simple, they accepted the trajectory. We refused it. You rebuilt the biosphere from 400 million survivors. From 400 million on a planet whose soil was poisoned, whose oceans were acidified, whose atmosphere was trending toward conditions incompatible with large-scale mammalian respiration. Odessa spoke the litany without emotion, not because the emotion was absent, but because the facts had been recited so many times across so many millennia that they had been refined to their essential weight, the way a river smooths a stone. The atmospheric restoration took 8,000 years of active intervention. The ocean chemistry, 12,000. The forests were the longest project. 30,000 years of replanting, species reintroduction, soil remediation, watershed engineering. We did not simply grow trees. We rebuilt the ecological networks that made forests possible, from soil microbiome through apex predators. And the military infrastructure. That came when we decoded your survey beacon and understood we were not alone. The cities came once the biosphere stabilized. The warships came when we calculated that any species capable of interstellar survey would eventually return, and that we needed to present a choice, making conversation more attractive than confrontation. And if they chose confrontation? Odessa looked at the warships in the distance. Then it would be brief, and it would not be ours to lose. But that was never the design goal. We did not rebuild a world and carve 7 billion names into stone to destroy whoever came to check. We did it so that when they came, they would find us standing. And so the quality of our standing would make the choice obvious. Vane stared at the valley. His chest ached with something that was not physical pain, but the structural strain of a professional framework that had been load-bearing for 30 years, and was proving insufficient for the weight being placed on it. He had spent his career studying dead civilizations. He had knelt in dust on 9 worlds and pieced together stories from shards and fossilized waste. He had published 11 monographs. He had trained 42 students. He was the Concord's foremost expert on species that had failed. He had never stood inside a civilization that had stared at failure, quantified it, documented it, and then spent 300,000 years building the most thorough, most patient, most quietly overwhelming rebuttal to extinction any species had ever constructed. Not with rage, not with desperation, with discipline, with engineering, with the decision to carry every name, rebuild every broken system, decode every foreign signal, learn every foreign language, and build defenses that would outlast the civilizations they were designed to deter, because the alternative was to join the list of dead worlds that anthropologists excavated for academic credit, and that alternative was not acceptable. That evening, Vane sat alone in the quiet Sorrows research bay with the lights off, and the data from 4 days of discovery, glowing on his screens like the accumulated weight of everything the Drenathi Concord did not know about the universe, and he drafted his report. It was the shortest document he had ever produced. No appendices, no supplementary data tables, no citations, no supporting analysis. He had spent his career building the kind of dense, meticulously referenced academic documents that the Concord valued, papers where every claim was backed by 3 sources and every conclusion was hedged with appropriate uncertainty. This report had none of that. The data was beside the point. The data was 11 hours in orbit 300,000 years ago, and a file that said Category 9 cultural fossil, and the data was wrong, and the story of how wrong it was could not be told in tables and charts. The excavation license for Target 4417 must be rescinded immediately. The species classified as extinct is not extinct. It is not diminished. It is not recovering. It is a continuous civilization that has been building without interruption for 300 millennia. Its atmospheric engineering exceeds the Concord's capabilities by a margin I am not qualified to estimate. Its defensive infrastructure predates the Concord's founding by a factor of 16. Its institutional memory is unbroken across a timescale, with no precedent in any record I have studied. We came to excavate bones. We found a civilization that spent 300,000 years preparing for the moment when someone would come back. They decoded our language from a discarded beacon. They built warships that render our fleet irrelevant. They carved the name of every person who died during their near extinction into stone by hand, and the carving has been ongoing for 112,000 years. I recommend full diplomatic contact at the highest level. I recommend the Concord approach this species not as a subject, but as a peer. I recommend this with the understanding that the word peer may be generous to us. He added one final line. We filed them as dead. They spent 300 millennia proving otherwise. The least we owe them is the honesty to say so. He transmitted the report and sat in the dark listening to the hum of his ship, a vessel 11 months from home, parked on a platform in a city older than the civilization that had built the vessel. He thought about the Concord's newest orbital defense station, built 7 years ago, already requiring its first maintenance cycle. The humans had platforms running continuously for 192,000 years at 11% capacity, maintaining themselves. Their weapons never fired because no species in 100,000 years had been foolish enough to make it necessary. He thought about the Concord's greatest archival achievement, 9,000 years of records in a climate-controlled vault tended by 3 archivists and considered a civilizational treasure. The humans had 300,000 years of unbroken records accessible from a console on a defense platform. He thought about the Concord's language, which no species outside Drenathi space was supposed to know, which the humans had decoded from a discarded beacon and spent 140,000 years perfecting, until they spoke it better than most Drenathi. The distance between the Concord's self-image and this species' reality was so vast he could not see across it, and the most destabilizing part of that distance was not the technology gap, or the military gap, or the engineering gap. It was the commitment gap. The Concord's longest infrastructure project had taken 40 years. Earth's atmospheric restoration had taken 30,000. The Concord's oldest institution was the Academy of Sciences, founded 900 years ago. Earth's memory preservation system had been running continuously for 300 millennia, recalibrated annually, transmitting the same lesson to every generation. We nearly died, and the dying was a choice, and we chose differently, and we will keep choosing differently for as long as we exist. That was the thing Vane could not fit into any professional category, not the warships, not the defense ring, not the atmospheric engineering, the commitment, the sheer, relentless, generational stubbornness of a species that had decided to persist and then refused across 300,000 years to reconsider. On the morning of the 4th day, Vane stood on the landing platform for the last time. His team was boarding, carrying instruments and empty sample containers and the weight of what they had seen. Orath's soldiers were aboard, quiet, weapons untouched. The escort fleet held orbit, ringed by platforms that had tracked every vessel every moment and never threatened them. Odessa Vale stood beside her transport, simple clothing, nothing in her hands. Anthropologist Kesari. Liaison Vale. Your report will reach the Concord in 11 months. By then, we will have prepared a diplomatic delegation. We have been preparing it for some time. How long? Odessa smiled. The first time Vane had seen it, it rearranged everything, not triumph, not satisfaction. the expression of someone who had carried something heavy for a very long time and was setting part of it down, not because the weight was gone, but because it had been shared. Approximately 62,000 years. When we recovered your beacon, we knew you would come back, not when, not who. But a species that catalogs other worlds does not catalog them once and forget. Someone would return, and when they did, we wanted to be ready, not for war, for conversation. Vane extended his hand, palm open, fingers spread, the Drenathi gesture of respect. Odessa reached out and took it in a grip that was firm and warm and unmistakably human. I came here to bury your world, Vane said. You came because your records told you we were dead. We are not offended by the assumption. She released his hand. Travel safely, anthropologist. Tell the conquered what you found, and tell them the species they catalogued 300,000 years ago has a message. What message? Odessa Vale looked up. The warships hung overhead, patient, silent, immovable. The orbital ring caught the morning sun and threw it back as a line of silver fire from horizon to horizon. The defense platforms pulsed in their ancient cadence. The city rose behind her, tower after tower, and above the towers the bright sky, and in the bright sky the accumulated evidence of 300,000 years of building, of remembering, of refusing. We remember everything, she said. Every name, every survey. Every species that looked at us and decided we were finished. We remember them all, and we are still here. The wind off the city carried the scent of clean air and engineered seasons and the deep mineral patience of stone carved with 7 billion names. That is the message, not a warning, not a boast, a fact. We are still here, we remember, and we will be here when the next one comes to check. Vane climbed the ramp. He did not look back. The quiet sorrow lifted from the platform, and the city fell away, and the warships shrank against the sky, and the orbital ring diminished to a thread, and then a line, and then nothing. And the defense ring resolved around the planet like a crown of ancient stations pulsing in a cadence older than the Drenathi conquered, older than the conquered's language, older than the conquered's first mastered fire. Vane stood at the viewport and watched the planet turn below him, blue and green and white, alive, impossibly alive, defiantly alive, and he understood with a clarity that felt like the ground shifting beneath every foundation he had ever built that he had spent 30 years asking the wrong question. He had always asked, why did they die? The answer on every dead world had been the same. They died because the crisis exceeded their will, because the cost of continuing outweighed the cost of stopping, because they chose the easier path. Earth had chosen the harder one. Earth had chosen it 300,000 years ago, when 400 million survivors stood in the ruins of a civilization that had housed 8 billion, and made a decision that was not hope, not prayer, not wishful thinking, but the cold, clear, measured commitment of a people who had already lost everything that could be lost and decided the losing was finished. They would carry every name, rebuild every system, learn every language left behind by the species that had dismissed them. Build defenses that would outlast the civilizations. Those defenses were designed to deter, and they would wait. Not for rescue, not for luck, not for someone to notice. For the day when someone would come back to check and find them standing over their own grave, alive, patient, and ready. Ready the way only a people who had already survived the worst could be ready, with a message that was not a threat and not a boast but something quieter and harder and more permanent than either. We are still here. The anthropologist who had spent his life studying the dead stood at the viewport of a ship named for sorrow and pressed his forehead against the cold glass and closed his eyes. The planet turned below him in its ancient light. The defense ring pulsed. The cities shone. 7 billion names carved into the mountain waited in their patient stone. When he opened his eyes, Earth was still there. After everything, after the collapse and the poisoned soil and the acidified oceans and the dying atmosphere and the scout who spent 11 hours deciding they were finished, and the 300,000 years of silence that followed. Still there,